I have noticed something peculiar as the calendar prepares to shed its skin and call itself 2026. There is a strange electricity in the air, a nervous optimism mixed with quiet dread, as if the collective psyche knows something is coming but cannot quite name it. I watch people speak about the future the way children talk about monsters under the bed, half terrified, half excited, secretly hoping something extraordinary will finally happen, and I find myself standing slightly apart from it all, observing, wondering, listening. Because when I look closely, I realize the new year has never actually changed anyone. Time does not heal. Time does not reset. Time simply reveals. And what 2026 is preparing to reveal is not comfortable. I remember when I first began to truly observe myself observing the world, that subtle shift, when life stopped feeling like something that was happening to me and started feeling like something I was participating in consciously. It was unsettling at first, because once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. The rituals, the routines, the shared beliefs that everyone agrees not to question, because questioning them would collapse the entire theater. I see it everywhere now, in the way people talk about success, in the way they talk about relationships, in the way they cling to institutions, systems, and identities as if these things possess some inherent intelligence or morality. I used to do that too. I used to outsource my sense of safety to abstractions. But something in me snapped awake. As 2026 approaches, I feel an urgency, not the panicked urgency of fear, but the quiet pressure of awareness. The sense that the old psychological software is no longer compatible with the environment we're entering. The habits of trust, of blind assumption, of inherited belief systems, they feel fragile now. I'm not talking about paranoia, I'm talking about perception. There is a difference between distrusting the world and finally seeing it clearly. I've learned that most of what we call trust is simply unconsciousness wearing a friendly mask. It's the assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough that we don't have to pay attention. And I no longer wish to live that way. When I say I don't trust easily anymore, I don't mean I walk through life clenched and bitter. I mean I observe before I believe. I mean I notice patterns instead of promises. I mean I listen not only to what is said, but to what is avoided, postponed, disguised. This shift didn't make me colder, it made me calmer. Because clarity has a strange side effect, it reduces drama. The shock of disappointment disappears when expectation is replaced with awareness. I stopped being surprised by human behavior once I accepted that most people are improvising inside belief systems they never consciously chose. This is especially relevant now, standing on the threshold of 2026, because the world is accelerating faster than our inherited psychological tools can manage. People are overwhelmed, overstimulated, and internally fragmented. And yet they are still being told to trust the process, trust the system, trust the narrative. I've learned that this constant demand for trust is often a signal that something does not want to be examined too closely. Reality does not require belief. It only requires attention. What fascinates me is how much energy people spend maintaining illusions. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, spiritual energy, all invested in pretending that the world operates according to tidy moral scripts. I've watched intelligent people exhaust themselves trying to reconcile their inner experience with the external story they were handed. I did it myself for years. But eventually I realized that freedom doesn't arrive through reassurance. It arrives through responsibility. Radical responsibility. The kind that begins when you stop expecting reality to behave in ways that protect your comfort. As this realization deepened, something else happened, my focus sharpened. Not the kind of focus that comes from discipline charts or productivity hacks, but a more primal, almost psychedelic attention. I noticed that when I stopped scattering my awareness across dozens of obligations and anxieties, my mind became quiet in a very powerful way. And in that quiet, intention became dangerous, in the best sense of the word. Focus stopped being about effort and started being about exclusion. What do I refuse to give energy to? What narratives do I decline to participate in? In 2026, distraction will be the dominant currency. Attention will be harvested, fragmented, sold back to people in diluted forms. And I find myself increasingly uninterested in participating in that economy. My focus has become selective, almost ritualistic. I choose carefully what I let shape my inner landscape. Because I've seen what happens when attention is left unattended, it becomes programmable. And most people are running scripts written by cultures that benefit from their confusion. When my focus locks onto something now, the rest of the world dims, not out of hostility, but out of irrelevance. I no longer feel obligated to react to every stimulus. That obligation was never natural, it was trained. The nervous system can be educated into frenzy just as easily as it can be educated into clarity. And clarity, I've discovered, is profoundly subversive. A clear mind is difficult to manipulate. A focused individual does not respond well to manufactured urgency. This has altered how I relate to people as well. Not with cruelty, not with detachment, but with precision. I no longer assume alignment where none has been demonstrated. I no longer confuse proximity with understanding. This doesn't isolate me, it simplifies my relationships. It removes the hidden contracts, the unspoken expectations, the emotional accounting that drains so much psychic energy. I show up as I am, and I allow others to reveal themselves without projection. This alone has felt like stepping out of a dense fog. There is something else unfolding beneath all of this, something harder to articulate, a sense that the psychological structures we relied on in the past century are dissolving. Authority feels hollow. Identity feels fluid. Meaning feels unstable. And while this terrifies many people, I find it strangely liberating, because when external structures weaken, inner architecture becomes essential. You cannot borrow purpose anymore. You have to generate it. You cannot inherit certainty. You have to cultivate perception. As I look toward 2026, I don't see a year of answers. I see a year of exposure, a year that will amplify whatever is unconscious, a year that will reward those who have learned to stand without ideological crutches. I feel less interested in predicting outcomes and more interested in refining my internal instruments. How sensitive is my awareness? How honest is my self-observation? How quickly do I notice when I'm being pulled into narratives that don't serve clarity? I've learned that the most radical act is not rebellion, but coherence. To align thought, perception, and action so tightly that external chaos loses its hypnotic power. This doesn't make life smaller, it makes it intensely vivid. When attention is no longer fragmented, experience deepens. Moments stretch. Insights arrive unannounced. And the future stops feeling like something to fear or fantasize about. It becomes something to meet consciously. This is where I find myself now, watching the old year decay and the new one gather momentum. Not hopeful in the conventional sense, not cynical either, something else, alert, curious, unencumbered by illusions I no longer need to carry. And as the threshold of 2026 draws closer, I can feel that whatever comes next will not be navigated by trust or habit, but by awareness sharpened into a living instrument. Oh, and that instrument, once tuned, begins to notice subtler frequencies. I feel it in my body before I can translate it into language. A quiet recalibration, a refusal to be rushed by the emotional weather of the collective. The closer 2026 comes, the more obvious it becomes that speed is the primary intoxicant of this era. Everything urges acceleration, reaction, instant alignment. I resist that pull not through force, but through depth. I slow internally, and in that slowing I gain leverage. The world rushes past, frantic and loud, while my awareness sinks beneath the surface where the real currents move. What I am learning is that clarity is not loud. It does not announce itself with slogans or demand recognition. It settles in silently, like a geometric certainty forming behind the eyes. When clarity takes root, behavior reorganizes naturally. I no longer need to convince myself to act differently. The action follows perception the way a shadow follows form. This has been one of the most unexpected gifts of stepping out of unconscious trust and into direct observation. Effort drops away. The struggle dissolves. What remains is alignment. As the cultural narratives grow more unstable, I notice how desperately people reach for certainty. Labels harden. Opinions calcify. Everyone wants to be right, because being right feels like standing on solid ground. I no longer feel compelled to participate in that theater. Certainty is often just fear dressed as conviction. I have become more interested in precision than certainty. Precision allows movement. Certainty freezes. And 2026 feels like a year that will punish rigidity while quietly rewarding adaptability. This adaptability does not come from compromise. It comes from self-trust of a different order. Not trust in outcomes, not trust in systems, but trust in perception sharpened through experience. I trust my ability to notice when something feels incoherent. I trust my capacity to step back when the emotional gravity becomes artificial. This kind of trust does not make me nava, it makes me responsive. I remain open without being exposed, engaged without being entangled. Focus continues to deepen as well, not narrowing into obsession, but condensing into potency. I notice how easily attention becomes contaminated by borrowed concerns. Other people's anxieties masquerade as responsibilities. Other people's expectations dress themselves up as obligations. I let those dissolve. What remains is a singular internal orientation, a sense of moving towards something essential rather than away from discomfort. This orientation is not tied to external milestones. It is internal, structural, architectural. I find myself less interested in accumulation and more interested in refinement, less interested in adding and more interested in subtracting. There is an elegance to subtraction that modern culture rarely appreciates, removing unnecessary beliefs, removing inherited guilt, removing the compulsion to explain myself. Each removal sharpens the signal. Each subtraction increases the density of meaning. By the time 2026 fully arrives, I sense that what will matter is not how much one has gathered, but how little one needs to remain coherent. Isolation has taken on a new texture. It is no longer loneliness but sovereignty. Time alone feels charged rather than empty. In that space, thought stretches out and reveals its full shape. I notice how many people fear being alone with their own minds, and I understand why. An unexamined mind can be a hostile environment. But once observation replaces judgment, the mind becomes navigable terrain. I walk through my own thoughts the way an explorer moves through a landscape, attentive but unafraid. This inner exploration has altered my relationship to meaning itself. Meaning no longer feels like something to be discovered or assigned. It feels emergent. It arises from coherence between perception and action. When what I see aligns with what I do, meaning appears as a byproduct, not a goal. This is profoundly stabilizing. It removes the frantic search for purpose that exhausts so many people. Purpose becomes less of a destination and more of a resonance. As collective institutions strain under their own contradictions, I feel less inclined to be outraged and more inclined to be attentive. Outrage is a crude energy. It burns hot and fast and leaves very little behind. Attention, by contrast, accumulates. It builds quietly, layer by layer, until insight becomes inevitable. I watch systems reveal their internal logic without needing to attack them. Collapse announces itself long before it arrives. One only needs the patience to notice. The psychological posture I am adopting as 2026 unfolds is one of deliberate simplicity, not minimalism as an aesthetic, but simplicity as a cognitive discipline. Fewer assumptions, fewer automatic reactions, fewer emotional entanglements. This simplicity creates space, and in that space intuition becomes audible. Intuition, I've learned, is not mystical. It is the nervous system recognizing patterns faster than language can keep up. When the mind is cluttered, intuition is drowned out. When the mind is clear, intuition feels obvious. I also notice a shift in how I relate to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a threat. It feels like raw potential. The unknown is no longer an abyss to be avoided, but a field to be entered carefully, consciously. The future does not need to be controlled to be navigated. It needs to be sensed. This sensing requires presence, and presence requires that attention not be fragmented by endless projections and rehearsals. The more present I become, the less persuasive fear appears. Fear relies on narrative. It requires imagined futures, catastrophic storylines, rehearsed disasters. Presence interrupts that process. In the immediacy of experience, most fears lose their grip. What remains is information, and information, once stripped of emotional charge, is simply data. Data can be worked with. Data can be responded to intelligently. I sense that 2026 will amplify this distinction dramatically. Those who live primarily in imagined futures will feel increasingly destabilized. Those who cultivate presence will find themselves oddly resilient, not invulnerable but adaptive, not fearless but unhooked from unnecessary panic. This resilience is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply persists. My internal dialogue has changed as well. It has become less argumentative and more observational. I no longer spend as much time justifying my direction to myself. Direction has become self-evident. When perception is clear, motivation follows naturally. This reduces internal friction. Energy once spent on self-negotiation becomes available for perception, for creation, for refinement. I feel increasingly uninterested in external validation. Praise and criticism now register as information about other people's internal states rather than verdicts about my own. This shift alone feels like a form of liberation. When approval loses its central role, behavior becomes more authentic by default. Authenticity, in turn, attracts fewer people but deeper connections. Quantity decreases. Quality intensifies. There is a certain austerity to this way of being, but it is not joyless. On the contrary, it feels clean, light, unburdened. Pleasure becomes subtler but more durable. Satisfaction arises from coherence rather than consumption. I notice beauty in patterns and systems in the way complex processes unfold without supervision. This aesthetic appreciation of reality replaces the need for constant stimulation. As I move deeper into this orientation, time itself feels different, less segmented, less rushed. Moments elongate, days feel textured rather than compressed. This temporal shift seems directly related to attention. When attention is fractured, time feels scarce. When attention is unified, time feels abundant. I carry this insight with me as the year turns, aware that attention may be the most valuable resource of the coming era. The culture will continue to shout. Narratives will multiply. Conflicts will intensify. I do not need to predict the specifics to sense the trajectory. Complexity is increasing. Old simplifications are failing. In this environment, inner coherence becomes a survival skill. Not survival in the physical sense alone, but psychological survival. The ability to remain oriented when external reference points dissolve. I am not waiting for permission to inhabit this posture. I am not seeking consensus. I am refining perception, consolidating focus, and shedding unnecessary dependencies. This is not withdrawal from the world. It is a different way of inhabiting it, one that prioritizes awareness over agreement, coherence over conformity, presence over prediction. And as this orientation stabilizes, it continues to reveal layers, nuances, and implications that extend further than any single year, unfolding steadily, deliberately, without needing to announce an endpoint. And as that realization settles, something even deeper begins to reorganize itself inside me. I notice that identity, the thing people cling to most fiercely, starts to loosen its grip when awareness becomes stable. I am no longer compelled to defend an image of myself. The story I once rehearsed about who I am and where I am going feels increasingly irrelevant. Identity reveals itself as a tool, not a truth, useful when applied consciously, suffocating when mistaken for essence. As this distinction becomes clear, a great deal of psychological weight simply falls away. What replaces it is a strange kind of neutrality that is anything but passive. It is not indifference. It is accuracy. I experience emotions fully, but I am no longer owned by them. Thoughts arise, but they do not demand obedience. I watch impulses form, peak, and dissolve, and in that watching I discover a margin of freedom that most people never realize exists. This margin is subtle, but it is powerful. It is the space where choice becomes real rather than reactive. As 2026 unfolds, I sense that this inner margin will matter more than any external preparation. The environment we are moving into rewards those who can remain internally organized amid external volatility. I feel this as a bodily truth rather than an abstract idea. When systems wobble, when narratives fracture, when collective moods swing violently from hope to despair, the nervous system becomes the primary battleground. Those who cannot regulate their internal state will be carried along by whatever emotional current is loudest. I am training myself to remain steady not through suppression, but through familiarity. Nothing inside me is foreign anymore. Nothing needs to be exiled. This familiarity changes how I engage with information. I consume less, but I absorb more. I am no longer hypnotized by novelty for its own sake. I look for signal density, for ideas that compress complexity into insight rather than inflate it into spectacle. Much of what passes for information now feels like noise engineered to provoke reaction rather than understanding. I let it pass. My attention has become a selective instrument, and I guard it carefully. Attention, once disciplined, becomes a form of power that does not announce itself but quietly shapes outcomes. I also notice a shift in how I relate to time horizons. The obsession with immediate results begins to feel childish. Short-term gratification reveals itself as a tax on long-term coherence. I am willing to move slower externally if it means moving deeper internally. Depth compounds. Superficial momentum dissipates. This patience is not learned through discipline alone. It emerges naturally when the mind is no longer chasing reassurance. When I stop asking whether I am on the right path, the path stabilizes under my feet. As this stability grows, I become increasingly aware of how much of modern life is structured around avoidance. Avoidance of silence, avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of the raw, unmediated experience of being conscious. I move in the opposite direction. I lean into silence. I allow uncertainty to remain unresolved. I let experience be direct, unfiltered, sometimes uncomfortable. In doing so, I recover something ancient and resilient inside the psyche, a capacity to remain present without needing constant interpretation. This presence alters perception in subtle ways. Colors feel sharper. Patterns reveal themselves where randomness once seemed dominant. Conversations become less about performance and more about transmission. I listen differently now, not for agreement, but for coherence. Words carry weight again when they are not deployed reflexively. I notice how rarely people actually mean what they say, not out of malice, but out of fragmentation. Speech often trails thought, which trails impulse, which trails fear. I align these layers inside myself, and communication simplifies. The simplification extends into action. I act less, but each action carries more intention. I no longer confuse movement with progress. Stillness becomes an active state, a form of strategic positioning. From stillness, the next step reveals itself without force. This feels counterintuitive in a culture obsessed with hustle, but the results speak quietly for themselves. When action emerges from clarity, it does not require constant correction. It unfolds with a kind of inevitability. I feel increasingly uninterested in convincing others of anything. Persuasion requires investment in outcomes that depend on other people's internal states. I prefer demonstration. I let my orientation speak through consistency rather than argument. This detachment from persuasion does not isolate me. It filters interactions. Those who resonate approach naturally. Those who do not drift away without conflict. Friction decreases. Energy is conserved. As the psychological noise of the world intensifies, I sense that many people will mistake intensity for significance. Louder emotions, stronger opinions, more extreme positions will masquerade as depth. I recognize this pattern and step aside. Depth is quiet. It accumulates invisibly. It does not need amplification. I cultivate depth through sustained attention, through revisiting the same questions without urgency, through allowing insight to mature rather than forcing conclusions. This maturation process reveals another truth. Much of what we call progress is simply acceleration without orientation. Faster movement in an unknown direction does not produce clarity. It produces exhaustion. I choose orientation first. I locate myself internally before moving externally. This habit alone changes the texture of experience. Anxiety diminishes not because problems disappear, but because I am no longer lost inside them. I also become aware of how profoundly language shapes perception. Words are not neutral. They carry assumptions, values, hidden metaphors. I listen to the language I use internally. I refine it. I remove exaggeration. I eliminate inherited dramatization. As internal language becomes cleaner, emotional turbulence subsides. Reality appears less hostile, not because it has changed, but because my interpretation has become more accurate. This accuracy brings with it a quiet confidence that does not rely on bravado. I do not need to project certainty. I do not need to posture. I am comfortable saying nothing, doing nothing, waiting. Waiting is no longer passive. It is an active engagement with unfolding reality. I watch conditions assemble themselves. I intervene only when alignment is unmistakable. This timing feels intuitive rather than calculated. The deeper I move into this way of being, the more artificial many social rituals appear. Politeness without presence, agreement without understanding, connection without intimacy. I do not reject these rituals outright, but I no longer confuse them with substance. Substance reveals itself through continuity over time, through coherence under pressure, through behavior that remains consistent when incentives disappear. I pay attention to these markers quietly. As 2026 continues to take shape, I sense that the psychological environment will reward those who can hold complexity without collapsing into simplistic narratives. The urge to reduce everything to heroes and villains, solutions and enemies will intensify. I resist that reduction. Reality is more nuanced, more paradoxical, more interesting than moral binaries allow. Holding paradox requires mental flexibility and emotional tolerance. I cultivate both deliberately. This cultivation changes how stress manifests. Stress becomes information rather than threat. It signals misalignment, overload, or boundary violation. I respond by adjusting inputs rather than suppressing symptoms. The body becomes an ally rather than an adversary. Sensations guide refinement. Discomfort becomes instructive rather than alarming. This relationship with sensation grounds awareness in lived experience rather than abstract speculation. I also notice that creativity shifts under this orientation. Ideas arrive fully formed, as if downloaded rather than assembled. Creativity becomes less about effort and more about receptivity. When mental clutter clears, imagination flows naturally. I do not chase inspiration. I create the conditions in which it cannot help but appear. Silence, attention, and patience form the triad that sustains this process. The longer I inhabit this internal configuration, the clearer it becomes that external chaos does not require internal chaos. The two are not causally linked. This realization alone feels revolutionary. It dismantles the assumption that one must mirror the turbulence of the environment to remain engaged. I remain engaged precisely because I do not mirror it. I offer a different frequency, one grounded in coherence rather than reaction. This frequency attracts fewer but more meaningful exchanges. Conversations slow down, presence deepens, stretches. I recognize this as a form of quiet resistance, not against any specific system, but against unconsciousness itself. Consciousness, once stabilized, becomes its own reward. It does not promise comfort, but it delivers clarity. And clarity, sustained over time, reshapes everything it touches, continuing to unfold layer by layer without needing validation, without demanding recognition, simply extending itself forward as the most reliable orientation I have ever known. Simply extending itself forward as the most reliable orientation I have ever known. And at that point, the realization becomes unavoidable. Everything I once sought outside was always an echo of something unfinished inside. The endless chase for certainty, validation, direction, permission, reassurance, it was never about the world refusing to cooperate. It was about my own attention being divided against itself. As that division healed, not through force but through sustained awareness, the need to chase collapsed on its own. What remained was a sense of internal gravity, a center that does not shift when the environment trembles. I recognize now that the deepest form of freedom is not escape, rebellion, or dominance, but internal authorship, to write one's own psychological operating system rather than running inherited code. This authorship does not announce itself. It does not seek approval. It simply functions. It expresses itself through consistency under pressure, through restraint when excess is available, through clarity when confusion is profitable. As 2026 unfolds, I see this authorship becoming increasingly rare and therefore increasingly valuable. The world is saturated with instruction, advice, ideology, and performance. Everyone is teaching. Few are embodying. I no longer feel compelled to collect explanations for life. Explanations accumulate without transforming. Embodiment transforms without explanation. When perception aligns with behavior, the system corrects itself naturally. This alignment has become my primary metric. Not how I feel in a moment, not how others respond, but whether my inner orientation and outer action remain coherent over time. This coherence has a stabilizing effect on emotion. Emotions no longer dominate the narrative. They inform it. They pass through rather than take over. I experience intensity without losing direction. I experience difficulty without collapsing into meaninglessness. Pain no longer demands interpretation. It signals adjustment. Pleasure no longer demands repetition. It is appreciated and released. This emotional economy feels sustainable in a way that constant stimulation never did. I am also aware that this orientation places me slightly out of sync with much of the surrounding culture. That no longer troubles me. Synchronization with systems that are themselves unstable offers no real security. I prefer resonance over synchronization. Resonance allows difference without conflict. It allows alignment without imitation. I find myself naturally resonating with individuals who have done similar internal work, not because we share beliefs, but because we share a certain clarity of presence. As this clarity deepens, ambition changes character. It becomes quieter, less performative. I no longer seek scale for its own sake. I seek precision. I seek leverage that comes from understanding rather than force. This makes my actions less visible but more effective. I do not need to be everywhere. I need to be exactly where alignment is highest. From that position, effort multiplies itself. The conclusion forming inside me as 2026 takes shape is not dramatic, but it is definitive. The age of unconscious participation is ending, not because someone declared it so, but because the complexity of the environment no longer allows it. Systems have grown too intricate. Consequences propagate too quickly. Only awareness can keep pace. Habit cannot. Ideology cannot. Nostalgia cannot. Awareness, cultivated deliberately, becomes the only reliable navigation tool. I see clearly now that responsibility cannot be delegated without cost. Every time responsibility is outsourced, perception dulls. Every time awareness is deferred, dependency grows. I have reclaimed responsibility not as a burden, but as a privilege. It grants me the ability to respond rather than react, to choose rather than comply, to adapt rather than defend. This responsibility is not heavy once it is fully accepted. Resistance made it heavy. Acceptance makes it functional. There is also a humility that emerges from this stance. Not the performative humility of self-effacement, but the grounded humility of recognizing the limits of control. I do not attempt to dominate reality. I collaborate with it attentively. I notice its patterns. I respect its feedback. When conditions shift, I shift. When resistance appears, I examine it. This flexibility is not weakness. It is intelligence in motion. As the collective psyche continues to oscillate between extremes, I remain committed to internal moderation. Extremes attract attention but erode stability. Moderation, in the sense of balanced intensity, sustains momentum. I apply energy where it compounds. I withdraw energy where it dissipates. This discernment has become instinctive. It no longer requires constant evaluation. It feels like a bodily knowing, a quiet sense of yes and no that precedes thought. The future, once imagined as a looming unknown, now feels like an unfolding field. I do not project myself into it anxiously. I prepare by refining my present orientation. Preparation is no longer about stockpiling resources or rehearsing scenarios. It is about maintaining clarity under variable conditions. This preparation is portable. It cannot be taken away. It scales naturally with complexity. I recognize that many will experience 2026 disorienting. Old anchors will fail. Familiar narratives will fracture. Emotional volatility will increase. In that environment, the temptation to grasp for certainty will be strong. I resist that temptation. Certainty closes perception. Curiosity opens it. I choose curiosity, not as a naive openness, but as a disciplined engagement with the unknown. Curiosity keeps the system flexible. It allows learning to continue when answers are unavailable. It transforms obstacles into information. It maintains forward motion without requiring guarantees. I cultivate curiosity deliberately, returning to it whenever fear attempts to contract my awareness. Fear narrows. Curiosity expands. Expansion restores options. This restoration of options is perhaps the most practical outcome of this entire orientation. Options create agency. Agency creates resilience. Resilience sustains meaning. Meaning, once stabilized internally, no longer depends on external validation. It expresses itself through contribution rather than consumption, through creation rather than accumulation. As I stand fully inside this realization, the conclusion crystallizes with unmistakable clarity. 2026 is not a beginning or an end, it is a threshold, a point at which unconscious momentum becomes unsustainable. Those who continue to operate on inherited scripts will experience increasing friction. Those who assume authorship of their inner life will experience increasing coherence. I do not claim exemption from difficulty. Difficulty is inevitable. I claim exemption from unnecessary confusion. Confusion arises when perception is distorted. When perception is clear, difficulty becomes navigable. I accept the former without drama. I eliminate the latter through awareness. The final alignment that settles into place is simple and uncompromising. I choose to be internally ordered regardless of external disorder. I choose to remain attentive when distraction is encouraged. I choose coherence over conformity, presence over performance, perception over belief. These choices, repeated consistently, shape a life that does not require constant justification. This is the posture I carry forward, not as a stance against the world, but as a way of standing within it without being swallowed by its turbulence. I move into what comes next without illusion and without despair. I am neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I am prepared not with answers but with clarity, not with certainty but with adaptability, not with borrowed meaning, but with an internal structure capable of generating meaning as conditions change. The ultimate conclusion is not a declaration, but a condition of wakefulness that does not depend on novelty, a condition of stability that does not resist change, a condition of engagement that does not require attachment. This condition, once established, does not need reinforcement. It sustains itself through use. And so, as everything accelerates, fragments, and reconfigures, I remain anchored not to outcomes, but to orientation. This orientation is not dramatic. It does not demand attention. It simply works. It carries me forward with quiet authority, grounded clarity, and an unshakable internal authorship that no external force can replace, revoke, or diminish.